Hello, my name is Jeremy Collins, and I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. The next session of our Memory Wars Conference is These Honored Dead: How Should We Remember Our Fallen? And we are delighted to have one of our advisors and friends, Dr. Clarke Lemay, to serve as the chair. Dr. Lemay is the acting senior historian at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. She is a Fulbright scholar and a presidential counselor to the National World War II Museum. And in 2022, she won the Smithsonian Secretary's Prize for Excellence in Research for her book, Votes for Women: A Portrait of Persistence, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2019. Currently, Dr. Lemay is co-curating 1898, U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions, a major exhibition about the Spanish-American-Cuban War and the annexation of Hawaii, and the Philippine-American War, slated for opening April 28, 2023. And she is co-authoring its accompanying book. Dr. Lemay's bylines include the New York Times and CNN Opinion, and she has published numerous peer-reviewed scholarly works addressing war memory, monuments, and visual culture. Her book, Triumph of the Dead: American World War II Cemeteries, Monuments, and Diplomacy in France, was awarded the Terra Publication Grant in 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Clarke Lemay. Kate?
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Kate Lemay. I use pronouns she, her. I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery. I'm the chair of this next hour's panel entitled These Honored Dead: How Should We Remember Our Fallen? The question we will address in the next hour concerns how we continue to remember the fallen of World War II. And I'm very eager to hear from our prestigious speakers and guests on this topic. I will introduce our speakers momentarily, but before we begin, we would like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Brigadier General John Sloan Brown, USA retired, PhD, has served as a historian for the American Battle Monuments Commission, the ABMC, for 16 years. Before that, he served in the US Army for 34 years, including command at every level from platoon through brigade, as well as staff positions at every level, from battalion through theater. He commanded a tank battalion in Operation Desert Storm and an armored brigade in Operation Intrinsic Action. Disabled, he served as the Army's Chief of Military History for 7 years, supervising historical services and support, publications, and the Army Museum System. His notable publications include Draftee Division, the 88th Infantry Division in World War II, and Kevlar Legions, A History of Army Transformation, 1989 to 2005. He authors the monthly column, Historically Speaking, in Army Magazine. And with the ABMC, he has participated in the design of numerous visitor centers, provided historical research and support, and authored books and articles. He also designed the digitized campaign interactivities and timelines covering American participation in World War I and World War II. Our next guest is Dr. George Hay. Dr. Hay is the official historian of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. He received his PhD from the University of Kent with a thesis focusing on the British amateur military tradition at war and in peace, a subject that has also provided the basis of a number of publications. His primary research interests include the composition, organization, and function of the armies of the British Empire and the legacies of the two world wars in the form of memorials, war graves, and landscapes. He is more broadly concerned with research relating to the establishment and work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, particularly variations in the ways in which it has commemorated casualties. Brigadier General retired Dirk Backen has served as the Secretary General of the German War Graves Commission since the 1st of May 2021. Prior to his civil career at the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, he served his country in uniform for 40 years. Starting as a conscript in 1978, he soon volunteered in the German army, where he held several positions as platoon and company commander, as well as staff positions. After finishing his training at the Joint Command and Staff College, 1994, he served several tours of duty in the Ministry of Defense, in NATO staffs, in several Army units, and with the Joint Staff. He has been on several operational deployments in the Balkans and Afghanistan, and assumed command of the 21st Armored Brigade in 2009. General Backen's last position brought him to the United States, where he served 4 years as defense attaché at the German embassy in Washington, D.C. After retiring in 2017, he joined the German War Graves Commission in 2019 as Director of Service and Cooperation. General Backen holds a university degree in economics and management and has been awarded several national and international military and non-military decorations, including NATO's Meritorious Service Medal and the U.S. Legion of Merit Officer class. Okay, so thank you all for being with us. I wanted to give a brief introduction to this panel. If I may have the first slide, please. As an art historian, I am constantly asking questions about the designs that were made in works of art and architecture. So I begin by looking closely at the war cemeteries, and specifically for this panel, the Lemay German War Cemetery, which was designed in the 1950s by the preeminent German architect, Robert Tischler. Okay, so I was just talking about how I'm constantly asking these questions about the design decisions. And I wanted to look closely at the Lemay German War Cemetery, which, as I stated, was designed in the 1950s by the preeminent German architect Robert Tischler. And he did not stray far from the original war cemetery design for the Wehrmacht. And on the left, you see in this slide the Nazi designs for Totenbergen, which means Fortress of the Dead. On the right, the mass grave of Lemay German War Cemetery that we know today is instead topped by grieving parents, statues of those two people, and Latin cross. And the next slide. I always find it interesting to note how in the original layout of the Lemay German War Cemetery, which of course was done by the U.S. American Graves Registration Service, these graves were marked by individual crosses, as you see here. And you're also seeing the original layout's blueprint. So note the terminology like enemy sector that designated the resting place of the German fallen. Next slide, please. And so built in the 1950s, Lemay was redesigned by Robert Tischler. And you can see how the layout of each grave has changed from its original spacing. So instead of marking each burial with a gravestone, the German architect placed 2 or more graves per marker. And he also placed the headstones flat to the earth, which achieves an almost hidden presence of the grave marker visually. Next slide, please. And design, in my opinion, has a direct influence on collective memory and how we understand World War II today. So, for example, we're looking at the various different headstones of the German nation, the US American nation, and the Commonwealth soldiers. So the various information that is put on these different headstones really reveals a different set of priorities by each nation's set of architects. And the information can be seen as bare bones, which you see in the middle of the German headstone, just birth date, life date, rank, and sometimes the name. It also can emphasize the military identity, which you see in the US American headstone on the right. And really only the Commonwealth endeavored to personalize the memory of the individual by offering families the space to compose a message engraved on the stone. The Commonwealth also emphasizes the age upon death. So these are things that have changed since the inception. Of course, the U.S. American war cemeteries have a lot of information now about the individuals buried under these headstones. But to me, the interesting comparison is at the inception of these headstones in the 1920s and 30s and onwards, and to see how the different nations really commemorated the fallen. So with these visuals in mind, I wanted to turn to our speakers and introduce again General John Brown, who will take it away with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lemay. I'm honored to represent the American Battle Monuments Commission, or ABMC, as this panel considers how war cemeteries influence collective memory. I have been asked to address mourning, healing, diplomacy, memory, and how the nature of memory may have changed over time. When I first began working for ABMC 16 years ago, my boss advised me that our role was to keep the grass green, to keep the marble white, and to tell the story. His pithy summary has proven a good metaphor for three major purposes the ABMC served. First, to assist the grieving. Second, to honor the fallen. And third, to further the remembrance of those memorialized in our cemetery. Let's start with keeping the grass green. Next slide. Even before there was ABMC, there were tens of thousands of American service members who died for their country in World War I. These were hastily buried near where they had fallen. The technology of times and concerns for health had caused these immediate burials to be necessary. They remained in over 2,300 cemeteries and 1,500 isolated graves for months or years. Eventually, their families were offered two options: to have their bodies repatriated for burial in the United States, or to have them buried overseas among their comrades in cemeteries designed to be ideal resting places. About a third chose the second option. The definition of an ideal resting place included harmony with nature. The honored dead were to lie in tranquil settings surrounded by trees, artfully placed gardens, and shaded retreats. Here those who mourned them could find solace and contemplation. A transition from war-torn battlefields to verdant parks was not just going to happen on its own. ABMC was established in 1923, took over the 8 consolidated World War I cemeteries from the U.S. Army Grave Registration Service, and invested heavily into horticulture. Battlefields did become new versions of the Elysian field. Horticulture remains a major fraction of the ABMC budget. Generations of groundskeepers, almost always local nationals, painstakingly attend the flora. The flora fits the surrounding ecology. In the Ardennes, for example, trees include oak, beech, ash, and evergreen. Near Anzio, one finds Italian cypresses and local pine. The results are the same: a reverent setting for grief and contemplation. Early on, ABMC sponsored tours to its cemeteries of women who lost their children in World War I. These were the Gold Star Mothers. Mixed with their expressions of mourning and grief, these pilgrims repeatedly commented that their sons and daughters were in the right place. This sentiment continues for generations. Nature herself assists in the grieving process. Now let's turn to keeping the marble white. Next slide. Those who mourn want reassurance the cause was just and the sacrifice worthwhile. Those who bear the risks of battle hope to be favorably remembered, whatever their personal fate. For thousands of years, service and sacrifice have been honored by monuments in marble and stone. Over time, there's been a trend towards democratization. Less attention is given to pharaohs and more to the rank and file. ABMC cemeteries embody democratization. The truest monument is the graves themselves, rows and rows of pristine white crosses and stars and David. Their brightness contrasts with the cool green of the grass beneath them. Durable frameworks connect the grave, keeping each in place regardless of weather or subsidence in the ground. No distinction is made based on race, rank, gender, or ethnic origin. Similarly, tablets of the missing list the names of thousands whose bodies were never recovered, carved in stone. The message of a shared purpose and shared sacrifice is clear. The fields of headstones are complemented by other monuments and chapels. These feature mosaic, reliefs, and classical design. World War I battlefields were discreet enough that monuments could be built on key terrain independent of the cemetery. World War II operations were so expansive, most monuments were instead co-located within the cemeteries themselves. ABMC has supervisory responsibility for private monuments and markers Americans build overseas, in addition to those built by the U.S. government. The purpose is to assure levels of dignity and maintenance appropriate to honor those who have fallen in the service of the United States. Now let's talk about telling the story. Next slide.
Thank you.
The first chairman of ABMC, General of the Army's John J. Pershing, famously said, "Time shall not dim the glory of their deed." This commitment to telling the story of our fallen has remained the mission of the American Battle Monuments Commission ever since. At first, maps, mosaics, and supporting narratives inscribed onto our monuments seemed sufficient to the job. Groups of visitors generally included some with personal memories of the war to explain things to their fellows. As the number of veterans diminished, more effort was needed. Millions with personal connections to the cemeteries were not able to cross oceans to visit them, at least not often. Those who could make the trip wanted to be prepared before they came. In 1938, ABMC published American Armies and Battlefields in Europe as a resource for those who couldn't travel and as a battlefield companion for those who could. Other books, brochures have followed over time. Even as I speak, we're working on volumes yet to be published. ABMC visitor centers have evolved to help tell the story. Originally, they were places of respite for weary travelers, but they've added museum-like features to assist in education. In 2007, ABMC opened an immersive visitor center at Norman. Similar initiatives followed at Cambridge, Chateau Thierry, Manila, Meuse Argonne, Pont-de-Hoc, and Sicily, Rome. More will follow. Educational efforts migrated into cyberspace as well, generating apps to accompany visitors on mobile devices and a website flushed with interactive articles, lesson plans, and other information. Some grumble that the story we are telling is not objective. This can be true, but misses the nuances amongst obituary, heritage, and history. Obituary honors the dead and speaks well of them. Heritage tells our side of the story and why we should be proud of it. History is scientific, cataloging the bad as well as the good and presenting all parties involved in 3 dimensions. Our initial memorials and inscriptions are best regarded as obituary. Narrative mosaics in our earlier visitor centers are best regarded as heritage. Our website, modernized visitor centers, and libraries maintained in each cemetery contain history per se. Staffs on site can help visitors seeking to make such distinction. Dr. Lemay, in her fine book, Triumphs of the Dead, has thoughtfully noted diplomatic purposes that ABMC cemeteries have served. The United States did want to remind other nations of its present contributions and sacrifice. It also wanted to acknowledge the teamwork that made victory possible. Icons representing Britain, France, and other allies stand out on our monument. When telling the story in campaign interactives or visitor centers for display, for example, we incorporate allied efforts as well as our own. Nations achieve their greatest results when working together. We're planning an ABMC monument on the Cold War. We can't think of a more pertinent message to embed in it than the value of alliance. We're being reminded of that vital message, even as I speak. Dr. Lemay asked if the emphasis of our memorialization has changed over time. In the early years, ABMC visitors had a connection to a loved one they lost. So ABMC sought to provide the big picture to put that sacrifice in context. Now memories of individual sacrifices are fading, even if the big picture remains generally understood. Each headstone represents a unique individual with family, friends, and loved ones. We increasingly find ourselves committed to telling stories of individuals to put faces on the bigger stories of which they were part. Now, in conclusion, let me have my last slide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. This final slide captures some of the overarching ABMC data relevant to World War II. It associates numbers with the grass that must be kept green, the marble that must be kept white, and the stories that must be told. In doing so, it underscores grieving to be assisted with, honors to be rendered, and remembrance that ties those purposes together. As Pershing said, time shall not dim the glory of their deed. Thank you.
Thank you, General Brown. That was super interesting, and I can't wait to talk to you more about that. Up next is Dr. George Hay.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, General, for such an insightful paper. I think there are some points of comparison we can definitely talk about later if people would like to draw the connections. I have a few slides to support this talk. They're largely pictorial. There was originally a video I had wanted to show if we had time. Unfortunately, my technological shortcomings mean we won't be able to get to that part, although if people do want to track it down, you can do so by visiting our website or searching YouTube for hashtag #WeAreCWGC. The reason I wanted to show that was because I think it does a good and succinct job at demonstrating the reverence with which the organisation still treats its core activities more than a century since its establishment. So I think at face value, that continuity is impressive in its own right. But what is perhaps more significant is what it says about our society's ongoing interaction with the dead of the 2 world wars. Looking beyond that video and back to this actual paper on how we remember, it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, for me to tell the story of the British Empire's response to death and commemoration following the Second World War without looking backwards. As with all history, there is a thread here, and it's a thread not just linking us to the First World War, but to the annals of wider British military history. That thread doesn't show logical progression in the forms and nature of commemoration, but a dramatic shift towards the turn of the 20th century, the reasons for which I'll come to. But a blunt and brutal truth about Britain's wars up to that point is that soldiers' bodies, and in many cases their names too, ceased to be of interest to the state and wider society once they died. The bulk of the common dead following Waterloo, for example, shared communal graves if they were not burnt on great pyres, with many later exhumed and robbed of their teeth. I will let you all go and look up the mysterious phenomenon that is Waterloo teeth on your own. More ghoulishly still, there was also an active trade in bones for fertilizer in the 19th century. Many, both animal and allegedly human, reclaimed from European battlefields. As one British newspaper put it in 1822, the dead soldier is a most valuable article of commerce, and the good farmers of Yorkshire are in a great measure indebted to the bones of their children for their daily bread. Now, looking at the cemeteries and memorials my organisation and those of my colleagues here now maintain for the two world wars, and knowing the social and cultural pressures that brought them into being, that quote and this apparent desecration of the dead appears extraordinary. Little more than 100 years after Waterloo, the same treatment of the dead was unthinkable, but why? Society had obviously changed in that relatively short period of time in historical terms. But surely not in a way that saw families feel and grieve differently. Creeping democratization, political awareness, these things probably had an effect, but perhaps the largest drivers of change were the nature of the forces employed, not professionals, but civilians in arms, and the obvious shift in the nature of war, the mechanization of which produced almost incomprehensible numbers of casualties and increased the weight and scale of that grief exponentially. So to reiterate that point, we need only look at the numbers for the First World War. The UK itself loses more than 800,000 personnel, while the wider British Empire suffered another 200,000 casualties. So those totals are comfortably more than 1 million dead ultimately, and the majority of those are suffered on continental Europe, but otherwise they are spread across the globe. The First World War then had really torn the very fabric of society, and the demands it placed on populations made it very difficult for the state to ignore growing public demands for recognition. However, from a British imperial perspective, rather than a retrospective operation, the need to provide that recognition was seen sometime before the war's end. Can I have my first slide, please? Fabian Ware, a man rejected from military service due to his age, had been on the Western Front since the very beginning of the war with a Red Cross ambulance unit. He had increasing concerns about what he saw as the state of makeshift cemeteries and a lack of records concerning burials. The general's already mentioned some of these issues in his own talk. Over the course of the early years of that war, he made great efforts to register and mark graves when he came across them, and goes to great lengths to ultimately convince the British War Office to take his work seriously. Now, from their perspective, it's initially due to fears about frontline morale rather than this sort of thought about maybe families and post-war grieving. Ware's vision quickly evolved from there and from that registering process, and it's driven largely by his recognition of the scale and, really importantly here, the diversity of loss among imperial forces serving in Europe. So ultimately, with the support of the Prince of Wales, Ware submits a memorandum to the Imperial Conference in 1917, suggesting the establishment of an independent organisation that would reflect the spirit of imperial cooperation and the permanence of commemoration. So that organisation would become my organisation, at the time known as the Imperial War Graves Commission, and its remit was the commemoration in perpetuity of all the dead of the British Empire, who had fallen in the Great War. Now, the nuances of this story are far more complex than I'm letting on, but it isn't, at the same time, it is still not far from the truth to suggest that the IWGC really owes its existence to this one man, and really his vision of bringing new unity to what was at the time the British Empire by recognising the commonality of sacrifice. So if we could have the next slide, please. The work of the organisation doesn't really begin in earnest until after the war, because the recovery of remains and their reburial in what would become permanent cemeteries was the responsibility of the Army's Directorate of Grave Registration and Inquiries, and you can see some of their work here. If we skip on a slide again, the Commission's job was then to take those cemeteries and make them into something fit for the Empire's dead, and this is a TARP military cemetery in the early stages of that transformation. For the 500,000 men for whom the fortunes of war had denied an identifiable grave, the Commission would also build grand monuments to the missing to carry their names. In both cases, this was not just to provide a place of grieving for the immediate next of kin, but these were sites designed to endure and act as sentinels in the landscape for generations to come. A permanent and reverent act of gratitude to the glorious dead, those who'd laid down their lives in defence of the cause, but also as a warning of the folly of war. And I don't have time to go into this, but Fabian Ware works closely with his French and German counterparts in the interwar years, talking about the power of the cemetery, the power of these monuments beyond simply places as warning. This work takes years. The final memorial at Villers-Bretonneux is unveiled in July 1938, just in time for the outbreak of Europe's next Great War. If we can have the next slide. And you can see just how those two episodes overlap if you visit the beautiful Hindu memorial at Neuve-Chapelle in France and wander around its perimeter. You probably can't quite see it here. But what you'll see is some pockmarks in the outer walls. These are the scars of the battle that cut through that area in 1940. And this obviously just ushers in the next phase of the Commission's work, which in reality is just one of depressing repetition. It's still led by the indomitable Fabian Ware. The organisation simply begins the same cycle, creating new spaces for grieving and commemoration across the globe. Though few of these sites actually look the same, and I'll leave Neuve-Chapelle there because it is probably one of my favourites. The broad approach the Commission has always taken was established by principles laid down in 1918 by the IWGC's artistic advisor, Sir Frederick Kenyon. Sorry, could I have the next slide, please? And these can be summarised as they are stated here. So each of the dead will be commemorated by name. Their headstones and memorials will be permanent, and that those headstones will be uniform and there will be no distinctions made. They hint at a couple of really important tenets in the wider Commission philosophy, which are the central importance of the individual through named commemoration, and then equality in death, i.e. There will be no distinction between those who have money and do not, those who practice a particular religion, or those who come from a particular race or ethnic background. That was really solidified by the prevention of repatriation of the dead. So this is one of the points of difference between the American approaches to commemoration and those of the British and the Commonwealth. And what it meant effectively was that all the dead would be commemorated side by side, and no one, regardless of whether they had the money to do so or otherwise, would be able to bring the dead home. So what makes that particularly interesting when it comes to the British Empire is the way in which the Commission dealt with the problem of the extraordinary ethnic and religious diversity it presented, and what that meant for the treatment of the dead. So if we can have the next slide, please. You can see here two of the really common features in cemeteries. One is very heavy with religious symbolism, and the other is deliberately a-religious. Depending on the makeup of the cemetery, you may not see the cross, and in mixed cemeteries, those for whom this would be inappropriate will be buried outside of its shadow. Those are the words that they used at the time. The stone of remembrance is carved from a single piece of stone and inscribed with the words chosen by Rudyard Kipling, "Their name liveth forevermore." And it hints again at that core concept of individual commemoration. Though it's suggestive of an altar, it was designed to be abstract and a-religious, so that it would appeal to all faiths and none, and speak to the enormity of the sacrifice made by those within the cemetery in which it sits. So we could have the next slide, please. Those a-religious factors carry on or carry over to the headstones that Kate has already demonstrated, and the shape of which is again abstract. This actually causes enormous controversy at the time, because there is a desire to see them as cruciform headstones. But it's something that's robustly defended by the Commission on the grounds of that already mentioned diversity of commemoration. So space is given to include a religious emblem, but again, it was not essential, as was the case with the personal inscription at the bottom. 66 characters originally offered to families of the fallen who could decide on their own epitaph. If we could have the next slide, please. So for those for whom burial was inappropriate, so think the many thousands of Sikh and Hindu soldiers of the British Indian Army, the Commission built cremation memorials like the one you see here at Kranji in Singapore. So however commemorated, the architecture and horticulture in all of these global sites was designed to command awe and respect for the dead, but also to provide a peaceful space in which we might connect with them. If we could have one last slide, thanks. So one final comment I wanted to make about horticulture and the specific challenges of the imperial context can be demonstrated by this picture, which is Ayet Indian and Chinese cemetery, admittedly not the best photograph, but what it does show on the left-hand side is a planting of ginkgo biloba, which is a tree native to China, and the use of that planting is designed to link those Chinese casualties with their distant home, and at the time of their planting, I think they're the only specimens in France. So the legacy of this work is really extraordinary. Can you have the last slide, please? I think there is one more. Thank you. Yeah, the Commission continues to care for graves and memorials across the globe. If we combine the First and Second World Wars, we are looking at upwards of 1.7 million British and Commonwealth citizens remembered in perpetuity for the sacrifices they made in those two conflicts. Although our direct links to these men and women are disappearing quickly if they have not done so already, these sites still demand our attention, and it is our job to keep their memories and stories alive and to ensure the consequences of the war that they fought are never forgotten. So that'll be me. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hay. I really appreciated the reading of social history that you introduced into that talk. So that was really interesting, and I'm eager to talk with you more about that. But let's move on. Up next, we have General Dirk Backen.
Yeah, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge e.V. That's a tongue twister. Even we Germans use the term just Volksbund. Makes it easier. And literally translated, it means a pact of the people. And probably makes the Volksbund a unique player in this distinguished group of stakeholders. Founded 1919 by citizens of the German Reich in order to recover the fallen of World War I and to bury them in a grave with dignity, the Volksbund was born out of the bare necessity to do this at all. After the loss of World War I, the young German democracy was simply not able to organize the recovery and the proper burial of the fallen due to political and economic turmoil throughout the country. Whereas in most countries, this task remains the responsibility of governmental organizations. In Germany and, of course, in Austria, it became a civil movement, which lasts till today. It's a charity foundation funded by donations, however, with an increasing additional support from the government. Today, the Volksbund takes care for over 825 war cemeteries abroad, with 2.8 million dead, and countless additional spots with single graves in 46 countries. We still recover annually approximately 15 to 20,000 fallen soldiers, nowadays mainly in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and that's still on our to-do list. We do have data to continue the search for another 1 million fallen and an additional 1 million soldiers who died in POW camps. One of the most challenging issues is to bring the historical data that we got into the field. Most of the graves are no longer visible. In many cases, urbanization has covered the former cemeteries and the graves are lost forever. In other cases, we do not have more than just a vague hint where to look for the fallen, like 150 soldiers buried just north of the church. When you go to that little village in Russia today, there might be no church, and you have to find someone who remembers it where it could have been. My recovery team then tries to narrow the area where to look for the graves, and then it uses modern technologies like georadar systems and drone imagery. In former POW camp cemeteries, the buried often are no longer identifiable because their ID tags were taken from them and not buried with them. And we find also additional victims, obviously, of the Soviet system, and even female bodies and children. As there were other nations fighting, either under German command, like the Romanians, or fighting in Waffen-SS formations, we also do have a significant number of foreigners in our cemeteries. In some countries, an example in the Netherlands, these so-called collaborators are even no longer deemed as citizens of their home countries. They have become Germans by volunteering to serve in the Waffen-SS. I will explain our special challenges using the war cemetery in Eiselstein, which is our one and only war cemetery in the Netherlands. It's very large. It's the largest one in terms of the area covered, and it was built initially by the Americans. And you'll find there everything, mainly Wehrmacht soldiers, but then also members of the Waffen-SS who were fighting like soldiers, though one can say it's a questionable combatant status, and not few of them entangled in war crimes. And then we've got members of the normal SS who often committed serious war crimes during the occupation time. And then the Dutch collaborators, male and female, and even children who died in camps nearby after the war. This highlights a special question. When I do lay down a wreath in Eiselstein, who do I honor? Can I honor all together, or can I honor them at all? Can I commemorate the larger group of victims, and let me include the plain soldier here? And even this might be discussed. And at the same time, commemorate in the same way the perpetrators, the murderers, and those who contributed to the Holocaust in the Netherlands. Eiselstein contains approximately 33,000 war graves, but 106,000 Jews, Sinti and Roma and other groups of victims from the Netherlands, they were deported, gassed or starved to death in the bloodlands in the east. They don't have a grave, but their death is related to the deaths of those in Eiselstein. Direct relatives, there are just a few left. For them, Eiselstein remains a cemetery, a place to mourn, to remember, and to lay down a flower on the headstone. Eiselstein, however, offers more today for the visitor, more than just being a cemetery. We've just opened a new visitor center with a modern exhibition, and attached to the cemetery is one of our 4 youth centers, where youngsters from Germany, but also from other countries, come together, study together the history and the biographies of the humans buried in Eiselstein. Our youth centers are just one asset of our international education program. Additionally, we organize international youth camps all over Europe using our war cemeteries as places to meet, even to work, for example, cleaning headstones, to learn to understand each other better. Exploring the historical context and individual biographies It shows people that there were clearly perpetrators and victims, and often many gray tones in between. Professional exhibitions at selected war cemeteries abroad complete the Volksbund's effort to inform the public and to foster an honest remembrance that is acceptable for the Germans, but also for all other nations. The third pillar is our educational program in Germany herself. Spread all over the country, our staff assists schools and similar facilities to teach and to educate pupils, youngsters, and even adults about our historical responsibility to maintain peace and to prevent war. This educational program inside Germany does not use the 825 war cemeteries abroad because it's not necessary. There are 1.8 million war graves spread all over the Republic of Germany in approximately 12,000 sites. The maintenance of these war graves falls into the responsibility of the local communities. However, they always cooperate closely with the Volksbund. The official German term means Kriegstote, that's war dead, and it does not only include fallen soldiers, but also killed civilians. Foreigners, like POWs, deported persons, etc., who died in labor camps or in concentration camps, they also fall under this category. A federal law in Germany, signed in 1953, provides the legal basis to preserve all their graves for the future. And it explains a bit the difference between the Volksbund and other war graves organizations. Although most of our cemeteries contain fallen soldiers, our commemoration is dedicated to all the people who died in the 2 world wars. Thus, for us, it cannot be an honoring remembrance, but rather a mourning, a reminding. Germany lost approximately 6.4 million people in the Second World War, 5.2 million soldiers. But victims of the German deliberate mass killings sum up to approximately 13.4 million, mainly in the bloodlands, but there are still many sites left in Germany. Because of these vast figures, memories and memorials of the 2 world wars can be found everywhere in Germany. You find them in countless locations just around the corner. Nevertheless, due to the growing time distance to those events, memories fade, and the meaning of the memorials and the gravesites become more and more irrelevant for the younger generations. The recent war in Ukraine, that's my personal opinion, will have an additional replacement effect in the minds of the people. The Russian attack on its neighbor casts a heavy shadow on the days to come. The generation that has witnessed the horrors of World War II is rapidly declining. There are less and less people left who can speak authentically of the events that led to the liberation of Europe, or should I say Western Europe, and the total defeat of Nazi Germany. Well, right after the war, the German society tried to focus on the Wehrmacht. So to maintain a rather traditional view of the losses of war. Shame and remorse of what the Nazis did it was growing, but overall people wanted to start a new life. They tried to forget and to repress the painful memories. Since the early 80s, public memory in Germany began to change, slowly but steadily. The perception of the Wehrmacht began to crumble.
About 1026,
the German war crimes gained more attention and showed how the Wehrmacht was entangled in them.
Thank you.
After the German reunification and the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Volksbund could start another historic task in the East. War cemeteries were built in Poland, Hungary, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and in other countries of the former Warsaw Pact. And last but not least, in Eastern Germany too. Almost 1 million fallen German soldiers have been disinterred and buried with dignity in Eastern Europe since the early 90s. This work was accompanied by major efforts to reconcile with those who had seen the bloodiest killing by the Nazis. The majority of the Shoah and genocide it took place in the bloodlands. The term I often use in the book, from Timothy Snyder. The Cold War thaw of the 90s supported the internationalization of remembrance in Germany. More and more sympathy was not only shown for the own losses, especially the soldiers, but more and more for different groups of all war victims. The recent decision of the German parliament to erect a monument in Berlin for the Polish victims of the German attack on Poland and the subsequent occupation, it marks another milestone in this trend. On the other hand, critics blame the government and the Volksbund. It puts too much emphasis on those symbolic acts of reconciliation and tends to forget the own national losses. Well, the Volksbund always tries to find a compromise between these two aspects of contemporary remembrance. Wars do not simply break out. They are man-made. They are prepared with aggression, questionable narratives, and even racism. The war in Ukraine follows exactly that pattern. The legacy for the Volksbund and its work from World War II is simple: together for peace, and peace needs courage. And this applies to those who just want to live a life in peace and refrain from any violence, to those who stand up against their despots, as well to our men and women in uniform who protect our freedom and democracy in a ceaselessly challenging world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, General Backen, and thank you to all of our guests today. This is a heavy topic, particularly given the circumstances of current events that we are all aware of with the Russian attack on Ukraine. So it seems to me especially important to discuss the context of how these cemeteries were designed and conceived. And I really appreciate Dr. Hay's remarks about the 19th century, to consider how understanding of death has changed from the 19th century through today. And the huge mass figures of the dead that all of our speakers reviewed, it's really daunting for the nations to, address logistically the burial and continued care, the finding of graves that are lost, and how to do so with thoughtfulness that recognizes the difficult circumstances of those soldiers and maybe the war crimes that they committed. I really appreciated how General Backen talked about, and I'm quoting from him, an honest remembrance that is acceptable. Because I think all of the nations have to somehow approach the ways in which war was conducted, honorably and dishonorably. So these are the sort of short summary of some of the ideas that I just heard. And I also applaud and appreciate the education efforts that the ABMC, the Commonwealth, and the Volksbund are all undertaking. That's a historic kind of effort as well. I've seen pictures of German and French high schoolers gathered and playing music in the German war cemeteries in France, from the 1950s. And I always was very moved by that effort for the nations to heal through their next generations. So I wanted to just ask a few specific questions before we open up to our audience's questions. So just to take about 15 minutes for a roundtable. And first for General Brown, I wanted to talk about the beginning of the ABMC, which you point out, really was with the World War I cemeteries. And John J. Pershing was in the role of its chairman. And this was a time when even the federal government in the United States was segregated. So Black employees were not to mix with white employees, and people of color were not considered eligible for certain jobs. And relatedly, I'm just thinking about that context, and then the ways in which the American headstone was designed with no distinction that was made, as you point out, on rank, race, gender, or ethnic origin. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, and if you think that's from Pershing's influence that might be read in this approach.
Well, that's a very insightful question. And I would say, yes, Pershing definitely had a role in that. In his earlier years, he had commanded Black soldiers in the American West. Some of our finest outfits were called the Buffalo Soldiers, and those were segregated units. They were all Black in the rank and file, and exceptionally capable. And so he had a respect intrinsic from his own personal experience for Black soldiers. But also during World War I, you had a huge effort within the Army to accommodate the diverse origins of all of its soldiers. And in particular, you had a major fraction of the draftees that were coming in were immigrants. And many spoke English as a second language, and some didn't speak English at all. And so there was this effort to make America a melting pot, and consciously within the armed services, you had this role of trying to integrate, even if you didn't integrate units, you integrated the concept of service, national service, and shared sacrifice. And then a third point I would make is that we were not building our cemeteries in isolation from the influence of our allies, particularly the French and the Commonwealth. And we had their good example in front of us as well. The Commonwealth was consciously avoiding any kind of distinction based on race. And that was something that we felt we should aspire to as well. A small example of that is the notion of the unknown soldier. The unknown soldier originated as a concept for the French. The British picked it up, and then we picked it up as well. And the idea was that you would pick the remains of a soldier whose identity was altogether unknown, and you would honor him to represent all of the fallen. Of course, this introduced the possibility that the soldier selected would have been Black, and that reinforced the instinct towards egalitarianism in the cemeteries as we move forward.
Thank you. I do sort of wonder about Pershing's experience in the Philippine-American War. General Backen, I know that was a race war, and if that was something that, because he was serving in Mindanao, if that's something that also might have played into his mind, since that was his most previous experience. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that operation influenced the entire Army, not just Pershing. I mean, folks were all conscious of the Philippine experience, and they were conscious of trying to avoid the racism that had manifested itself in some of the episodes in the Philippines. You rethink your experience of war as you process it over time and remember what you did well and what you're not so proud of. Yes, I think that service applied. But also remember, he had served in the punitive expedition in Mexico as well. And there was yet another occasion where you had a necessity to be able to have a vision that expanded beyond culture.
Thank you. My next question is for General Backen, and I'm curious to know a bit more about the history of the Volksbund and how, after World War II, and in spite of the odds against them, the VDK raised the money to pay for major architects like Robert Tischler or Johannes Kraun. And their designs, in my opinion, are the most striking of the war cemeteries because they do so much to kind of revive memory. Would you mind going into a bit more detail about the logistical challenges that the VDK faced in the post-war, the 1950s especially?
Sure. I have a simple explanation why it was not that difficult to raise money. Almost every single German family was affected. There was either a son, a brother, who either fell at the front or came back wounded. We had 11 million refugees in Western Germany after the Second World War, and they were, by the government, they were just put into your house when you had a free room. So you could see the consequences of the war everywhere throughout the country. And who built the war cemeteries after the Second World War? It was easy. It was the old comrades of the Wehrmacht mainly did in volunteer work. One of our best examples is our war cemetery on Crete, Lemay. That war cemetery was entirely built by paratroopers after the Second World War, who spent their holidays there and collected all the single graves in a cloister and then in a monastery, and then the cemetery was opened in 1974. Kurt Student, General Kurt Student, who led the Operation Mercure on Crete, the airborne operation, got away with what he did because he could easily be named a war criminal. But he was among the advocates to collect money for Lemay. And we've got pictures in our archives, photos, where you can see he's handing over a big check to the president of the Volksbund. So that's the way actually the Volksbund got the money. And then in the 60s, 70s, also we inherited money from when the people passed away and wanted their fortune to be used to preserve the war graves. That's a pretty simple explanation. Tischler is very ambivalent in the Volksbund today because it is he created really because he continued his work. He also had worked for the Volksbund before 1945 in several places, and he was really a dominating architect. And we have other Totenburgen, so the big castles, the fortresses in Northern Africa, Alamein or Tobruk, and Pordoi Pass in Italy. You can say that it is that he tried actually to express an ideological view of death in war through his buildings, and that is a kind of that is in contradiction to how German war graves were designed in the beginning. I have a book here, the guidelines of how to build cemeteries, war cemeteries, from 1917. And if I quote from it, avoid sentimental icons and all romantic accessoires. Aim for austere simplicity. I can't say that that Tischler did that. Okay.
Thank you. I can't say that he did that either, but because he's sort of a mysterious figure at least for U.S. American audiences. It's really very interesting to hear you talk about him. And I just wanted to follow up with one question, which is, when the VDK in the 1950s was doing its research, it was outlawed for German nationals to actually conduct any kind of military-related research in Normandy. And so I know that there was some sort of secret secret is kind of a funny word to describe this, but there was this one man from the VDK that was doing research, but under the guise of being a tourist. So that's something I was wondering if you knew a little bit more about, because I think our audience would be very interested to hear more about the restrictions that were placed upon the VDK in their efforts to create war cemeteries.
See, the legal basis for the VDK to operate abroad normally derives from bilateral agreements between our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the respective ministry in the country where we keep our war cemeteries. That wasn't given in the early 50s, so maybe it was easier because it was a private organization. It was not a governmental organization. And this process of acceptance, especially with our former Western opponents, it took a while. It was not done overnight. So when the first Germans appeared, let's say in Belgium, it was difficult. Of course, we know this from our archives. But can you imagine that in 1953, that was just 8 years after the end of the Second World War, in our war cemetery in Lommel in Belgium, we had the first binational youth camp between Belgian and German youngsters. I think there was a kind of common sense that we all together have to get over with it. I mean, to carry on, to look into a future that is rather peaceful and dominated by cooperation and partnership than by the elements that actually express the opposite. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Hay, this is a question for you. I have always loved visiting the Commonwealth war graves because they have such a unified design, but their headstones really demonstrate the diversity of the soldiers and airmen and the women who served and sacrificed their lives. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that decision, which you already spoke about, but maybe a little bit more about the agreements or disagreements that Fabian Ware had with his peers and some of the context that allowed the Commonwealth, to move forward with that kind of personalized epitaph on the headstone.
Yeah, the headstones themselves, it's a fascinating debate that takes place immediately after the war, and it's really a British-led religious movement, if you like, pressurizing for a cruciform shape, and there are, in the grand scheme of things, not enormous based on the number of people we're talking about, but the backlash to the suggestion that they will be abstract is huge, and that's just the shape. That's not just the inscriptions we're talking about. But I think it's interesting how seriously the Commission takes. And there are different parts, and there's a piece of work that I'm working on now, which is my day-to-day, which actually looks at the variations in the way in which the Commission has commemorated people globally, which in some cases is not uniform, but that's a whole different question. But for the most part, particularly if you're looking at Europe and on the Western Front, it is so sure of itself that it is not wavered by what are fairly weighty petitions to change its thinking and around the way in which those headstones will be constructed and the way they will look. But it is enormously important if they want to deliver what they ultimately do deliver, which is this idea that somebody can be of various religious denominations and none, but you still have the uniformity of the headstone when you're looking at them. I mean, you mentioned women there, which I think is a really interesting thing when it comes to looking at our cemeteries and actually any form of memorials that we do have, because women can be hard to find, because one of the details the Commission never collects, in the same way that it never collects information about race, is you can't therefore say, well, show me how many women the CWGC commemorates today. Because, you can't do that.
Okay.
You can't work it out. And what makes it harder still is that there are fairly large numbers of commemorations that we look after where we only have an initial for the first name and second name, which makes it practically impossible unless you go by the unit in which someone served and their rank. I'm drifting away from your original conversation, which I apologise for, but I think some of these things are almost byproducts of this insistence on equality. So without drawing lines in various ways, we don't collect data on a particular fact. It means, therefore, retrospectively, it's quite hard to work backwards to sort of work these things out. To speak specifically on personal inscriptions, I think they probably provide the most intimate insight into those lives lost and those forever changed by both of the wars. I think that there was recognition of the difficulty of balancing uniformity of approach, like we've just been discussing, that the Commission is insisting on, but also the needs of families to play some part in the commemoration of their loved ones. So for the First World War, at least, because I've got the figures, you have 230,000 personal inscriptions, wow. And they range from the literary biblical quotations, hymns, mediations on abstract virtues, informal addresses to the dead, and it's a really tantalizing glimpse into the sort of, I guess, the post-war process of grief. But for me, I find, and anyone who's gone on lengthy tours of the battlefields wherever they happen to be, but at some point you get what I describe as cemetery fatigue, and it comes the enormity of what you're looking at. You sort of cease to take it in, and I think reading some of those descriptions can really bring you back to reality, because they're not always platitudes. Sometimes they're so personal it's painful.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the personalization that you were just mentioning, it's in my research about the ABMC, because I had the Commonwealth in my mind as just like this big question, like why didn't the U.S. American Commission move forward in the same way? And actually they did for a very brief period of time after World War I, for about 4 months. But the kinds of inscriptions that U.S. American families were putting on the backs of these headstones were things like killed in action, which creates a hierarchy of death because so many of the soldiers died from influenza or other disease. And then the other sort of go-to kind of inscription was something that showed their elite status as kind of blue stocking educated, New Englanders. So they would quote from certain bishops or something like that. And so Pershing just put an end to it because it put forward an inequality, which you were just mentioning was so important to the British Commonwealth designers. And I really appreciate that too. And I also appreciate your questions about identity, because I work at a museum of biography, and one of the questions that we grapple with all the time is about someone's designation as LGBTQ+. And if we're looking at a historic figure that we know was gay from the 19th century, but they didn't self-identify, because of the context of the society, how do we tag them in our database? So these are all big questions that I think historians are across the board are grappling with today. And I thank all of you. I think now is the time to open it up to our audience's questions. Well, so Jeremy is going to help us with that.
Yes, thank you to our panelists, Kate, Dr. Lemay, a great session, great comments to what each of the presenters made. This is one of my favorite sessions, nothing against the others, because I've visited sites to all of the sites that are, all of the organizations, their sites. So, General Backen, the first question is to you. American service personnel visit American cemeteries? Do members of the German military visit Volksbund cemeteries? I think this is maybe in uniform or staff ride type visits.
Yes, they do. They do it not on a regular basis, but like just around the corner of each barrack in Germany, you'll find war graves. And I did that with my soldiers when I commanded platoons and companies and so on. We also have a close cooperation with our men and women in uniform. We conduct what we call work camps. So then they go for 14 days. It's like platoon size. They go out into a country like Lithuania, Poland, or France, and they take care of the war cemeteries. They work. It's hard physical work, but it has a double effect. First of all, we have we have a benefit from it because it saves us money. Secondly, it's a process that ties them together, and they learn a lot about what former German soldiers had to do, and they can deem themselves lucky that they live in a freer world.
Thank you, sir. The next question seems to be headed towards General Brown. How does the ABMC handle the graves of executed World War I, World War II U.S. military criminals?
Well, in some of our cemeteries, we have a separate section. One that was Site E at Wasim, for example, and that is kind of an exception to the notion that all are buried together and there's no difference made between them. But by and large, none of the soldiers that fought, or very few of them, were actually saints. We acknowledge that there's a mix of experiences and backgrounds within the fallen, but we bury them all together because they all served together. And as I said, there is that exception, such as Site E.
Thank you, sir. The next question is for Dr. Hay. We've got, what progress is the CWGC making on properly commemorating minority colonial war dead?
This is a really good question. Is what I was alluding to earlier. This is my day-to-day work at the minute. And those who are not aware, I'll try and summarize it very quickly, but a couple of years ago, it was revealed that outside of Europe, there are places where the Commission is not commemorating the dead by name. And in practically all of those circumstances, that is for those dead who were raised and served predominantly in East Africa. Now, it's a very complex set of reasons as to why they're not commemorated by name. Largely, it's allegedly, and we're finding this is not entirely true, but at the time it was alleged that the names of the dead were not known. They didn't have the bodies, the way in which those men, where they died and when they were buried by the armed forces during the war. What I was discussing earlier is taking place on the Western Front, which is rudimentary markers. This hadn't taken place. In most cases, there were no markers at all. And without going into more details about what's actually going on in East Africa during the First World War, you have upwards of 1 million men working in labour units, and they suffer from disease. The rates of death are quite extraordinary and terrible, and it is there that possibly the biggest issue is, and we think that there could be upwards of 100,000 names missing from our commemorations. So over the last year, as part of a much bigger project, we've been working in archives in East Africa as well as in the UK, seeing if there are records that can help us recover some of those names. As I say, at the time, and all the documentation we have within the Commission suggests that the information didn't exist. To give an idea of the progress we've made, we've got more than 6,000, which sounds big, until you start thinking about the numbers that I mentioned earlier, which is potentially upwards of 100. So small progress. The upside is we understand the issue a lot better than we did previously. We'll be talking much more publicly in the sort of coming years about what we now understand and what we're doing as an organisation to put right some of those wrongs. But it's at least in the case of finding the names, something I've said a lot today, but that is the basis of CWGC commemoration is attached to the name. We've got a lot of ground to make up if we ever can. It's entirely possible that the records do not exist, but that's what we're working on now.
Thank you, Dr. Hay. The next question is sort of a split question for two of our panelists at least. Dave asks, I'm curious about the difference in philosophy between the U.S. repatriation of the remains and the Commonwealth not doing so. So perhaps we start with General Brown about the repatriation efforts and then go to George.
There was considerable discussion at the time, and this is World War I, of the value of repatriating remains and bringing, the body home. Many families felt that they would not have closure until their loved one had returned home and was buried in a cemetery that they were proximate to and that they could visit on a daily basis or frequently. Others had the sentiment that they were comfortable with the idea of their loved ones lying overseas in the company of his comrades. And it was left to the individual family's decision. Each next of kin was approached, and the next of kin was given the option. The option, once decided, was permanent, but it was a decision that we felt was best left with the family members, the fallen. I would point out that the American casualties in World War I were considerably fewer than the Commonwealth casualties, so the repatriation presented less of a problem logistically to us than it would have had the Commonwealth tried to assume the same burden.
Thank you, sir. George, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's the last point the General made, I think, is a really powerful one. All I'd say in terms of the Commission's perspective is, I guess, the distance for the majority is much less. It's the English Channel. The Commonwealth, more broadly defined, obviously that distance is enormous, but in terms of numbers, if we're talking about the bulk, the distance is less, and I think that has some influence. But really, it also probably stems from the fact that the one curious thing about the Commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission is that it's formed in the middle of the war, and it's formed by a man who has a very distinct vision about what he wants to do in the aftermath of that war. And so it is, again, largely down to the pressures of Fabian Ware, where he gets an order signed to ban repatriation because it is happening on a limited scale. And there are people who are repatriated prior to that order. Very few. But the reasons given are one of are financial, and the fear is that the wealthy will bring their dead home and the poor won't. And I guess the other option to that is that the British state provides the option and then funds that repatriation. And I think perhaps that's deemed as splitting commemoration and diluting what is like the vision of where is deemed not worth the risk. I think that probably sums up the majority of the Commission's standpoint on it. But there are some interesting discussions with soldiers and officers as well prior to that point. And in many cases, whereas families may have preferred to have brought their sons, husbands, etc. home, in lots of cases you have very strong submissions from soldiers saying, well, if they die, they want to be buried with their comrades, they want to stay where they are. And I think that lines like facing the front line, they gave their lives to defend. There's lots of that sort of imagery, but I think it's primarily, again, down to this idea of the wider vision of the Commission and the fact that it's formed during the war.
Thank you, Dr. Hay. I'd be remiss if I didn't see if General Backen had any comments on the repatriation and the decision to keep those who fell, have them lie where they fell.
Yeah, it's more or less the same. There are the same considerations my two colleagues here have expressed. And normally, the idea of a soldier's death, it's not a, let's say, it's not a private death. It's a public death. And there's a kind of obligation also, moral obligation, that we maintain those graves, but all together. And as General Brown has expressed it, the sheer number, the size, is a monument in itself. It does not need a big building or everything. It's just when you overlook all the headstones, then you're moved internally. You can repatriate fallen soldiers in Germany at your own cost, and you lose the right for an eternal grave. That's possible. In some cases, you can see it in some cemeteries, but I would just classify them as single cases. Most of them remained.
Thank you, sir. Kate, do you have any close? Yes, ma'am. Please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the short propaganda sort of campaign that existed in the United States after World War I, which was by those who owned funeral homes. And they were encouraging people to, through these kind of sentimental ads in the newspaper, to bring the dead back, to bury their fallen, because there was such money involved for their benefit, for their profit. The same thing happened after World War II. And one of the sort of debates, was for those families who were thinking about it, was to listen to Theodore Roosevelt's famous statement about his son, Quentin, where the tree falls, there let it lie, which was reprinted in various ways, throughout the country's newspapers. And so at least for the U.S. American families and their decisions, there was a great debate about diplomacy, about thinking of, what the symbolism of their fallen soldier leaving that grave overseas, what that would mean. And it certainly, has stood the test of time, I think, in those overseas war graves to communicate not just American memory and a commemoration of the fallen, but also to various, visually assert American power.
Thank you.
Particularly in the context of the Cold War.
Thank you for the closing remarks, Dr. Lemay. Thank you very much to all of our panelists, Dr. Lemay, General Brown, Dr. Hay, and of course, General Backen. Also to you, the audience, please keep those questions coming. We'll get to as many as we can. I'd like to thank our sponsors for the Memory Wars Conference, EA, Respawn Entertainment, and Oculus by Meta, and especially for this session, the American Battle Monuments Commission. I want to thank General Brown, Acting Secretary Rob D'Alessandro, and Chairman Lieutenant General Retired Mark Herdling of the ABMC for their wonderful support and partnership on this program and our other educational initiatives we're partnered with. A special shout out and thanks to Major Ben Brands, an ABMC historian who helped in coordinating with us throughout this entire process. Thank you all.